Hi, everybody. I am coming to you from the lovely Alcyon Center.
Oh, that's where you are.
Oh, yeah. If you don't know about it, I recommend that you look it up. alcyoncenter.org. And I don't know, what is this, number 10 or 11?
I don't know how many books we've done, but it's a few.
And this time, we bit off something that was fairly ambitious. Short book though it is. This is James Hillman's Healing Fiction. So it's kind of a good, timely book because so much of what some of what we've done, especially Patrick Harper, leaned heavily on
James Hillman.
Yeah. But the usual question that we start with is going to be a hard one to answer. Like, what is James Hillman doing here?
Yeah. Like, what's the point of this? Part of the reason that's hard is because it's 3 essays and bound together, and they're all kind of doing something a little different, right?
Right. So the 3 essays are about Freud, Jung, and Adler.
Right. 3 major founding psychotherapists, right?
Right. And as usual, Hillman's got this big thing going on between something being literal and something being imaginal.
Right. I had to read I'd never read any Hillman before this book. I read this, and then I read Revisioning Psychology, because I understand he sort of expresses his whole theory there a little bit better. This is just 3 essays that sort of come out of that or precede that or something. So that was helpful for context. It seems like he, maybe more than anyone that I've read to date, makes a very strong argument for he articulates the strong argument for imagination, meaning that imagination is pretty much everything that we can experience.
Yeah.
And so, everything is sort of imaginal, and respecting that is sort of what health and sanity is. When you take things too literally, you take an image and you cling to it too tightly, that's where you start to go down a path away from sanity, something like that, right?
Right. And he'll even go as far as to say in the Adler essay, he actually says something like,
there's some pretty bold statements in there about what imagination is.
Yeah. He goes, he's quoting Adler here on page 124. I readily follow the ingenious views of Bahinger, who maintains that historically ideas tend to grow from fictions, unreal but practically useful constructs, to hypotheses, and later to dogma. And then this change of intensity differentiates in a general way the thinking of the normal individual, fiction as expedient, of the neurotic, attempt to realize the fiction, and of the psychotic, reification of the fiction, dogmatization.
Right. That's a lot. You just told us a lot there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So I think the fiction, the healthy sense of fiction, I get the sense of it. It's like metaphors that we use metaphors, and metaphors are apt, or they can be apt, and they don't have to be literally true. Like,
right.
He rode the relationship into the ground.
Right.
Right. So it tells us something very real, but it's not, no one rode the relationship.
Right.
And then the neurotic, it seems to me that the neurotic is somebody who's trying to realize something, that he's trying to bring the image. I don't know how to put it. It's almost like you're mistaking the imaginal for being absolute and conclusive. Like you're not realizing that your perception of the world is always through this imaginal lens. You're taking your imaginal lens to be final.
Right.
Yeah. And then the dogmatic one was really interesting, because that's when you're trying to make everything fit into the dogma, and if it contradicts the dogma, then it's false. Or
Right. I think your example of the metaphor is really good. I think we should add to that like he thinks of, well, he talks about fiction in a bunch of different ways.
right.
He talks about the sort of internal fiction that we already have. We sort of live, we imagine ourselves a certain way, we imagine our lives a certain way, we imagine our histories a certain way, and then we go on living in a way that is in keeping with the way that we imagined ourselves.
Right.
So I grew up this way, and, you know, if you had this shit that happened to you that happened to me, you'd be doing the same thing, or whatever the story is.
Right.
And then we live that out. And we, you know, if you've written inventory, you've seen the ways that you've had that kind of pattern, the sort of stories you told yourself and the bullshit that you did. And oh, okay. You take some responsibility for that, and then it can change, right? And then he talks about the therapeutic fiction, which is like the case history as a kind of work of fiction. He talks about Freud writing stories about his clients and stuff, and talking about how that's like sort of like an author writing a novel, but in this case, it's writing a novel like into the client almost, right? Like, we're going to tell you this story about therapy, and part of the story is that this story is good for you.
Right. It's a psychological novel.
Yeah. And then you as the client are the character that's then transformed by this story. You're internalizing a new story and taking it forward. In both of those cases, he says, you know, my pre-existing story that I imagine I'm already taking it literally. I'm already thinking it's really true about me that life sucks and everybody hates me, but I'm just gonna fuck them. I'm gonna keep going and like show them who's boss, right? If that's the story, I take that literally true. It's not like it's not something I'm creating. It's not something that's sort of flexible. It's just like literally true reality, right?
Right.
And that's part of the problem, is that I have these sort of literalizations that, rather than seeing this as a creative space where I can reinterpret life or whatever. And then in therapy, he says you could intervenes in that by showing you how your story is actually not literal, it's mythic, or it's metaphorical, or it's reinterpretable or something. But that therapy can also take itself literally and its own story literally, which would be like, I am the therapist and I do know what's right, and this is the correct interpretation, and this is science or something.
Or it could just be id, super ego, and ego.
Right. Yeah. The structures we've imagined are actually real and true, and we're going to find them in you. Right.
Yeah. But what he suggests is that he says somewhere in the part on the Jung section, he says there is not a multiplicity of worlds. There is one world, but there are a multiplicity of gods and daemons for which to experience that world.
Right.
And so becoming aware of those daemons or gods. Yeah, he quotes of course it's probably not an index in here. He quotes Auden. Um,
Yeah, what was that?
Um, it's in Jung. It's
This Auden?
we also he
Oh,
goes
it's Jung.
we are lived by powers we pretend to understand.
Right.
And so he believes that the soul is much bigger, and it's the whole world is ensouled,
Mm-hmm.
and that the ego is pretty puny in relation to the soul.
Right.
And the ego is what wants to do all this literalizing, or yeah, it can.
Right.
Yeah.
And that so what you just read, so this takes us into sort of archetypes and gods kind of thinking that he gets into, which is like, well, let me transition us there through one piece, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So we have this idea of, we have our internal stories and therapeutic stories and the literalization process of taking things too concretely or too specifically. And he's saying that not only is all of that, all of the stories we tell ourselves, they're imaginal, but imagination is much bigger than just a thing that happens in our brains. It's sort of like a realm. We sort of talked about this in Harper, a sort of a realm of imagination that's the whole world and us in it.
Yeah.
And that inhabiting that world are things that I guess, did he call them personifications here, or am I mixing up the two?
You're thinking of the other book.
The other book, okay. So there's things in this world of imagination that are not my ego, and they're not your ego. They're sort of bigger than either of our egos.
Yeah.
They can cause us to behave certain ways. They can kind of take over and sort of make us see the world a certain way. And in fact, I think he may argue that we're always
doing it.
We're always inhabiting one of these.
Or they are inhabiting us.
All right. And living out their own sort of desires through us in some way.
That's right. They're realizing themselves through us.
Right.
And he's really talking about, this is not from the book, but I think this is helpful. He's talking about non-human agency.
Right. That's right. There's like a personality with its own ideas, its own desires, its own perspective on the world, its own things that it would like to see accomplished.
Its own axe to grind.
Yeah. And there's lots of these. He's particularly fond of the Greek pantheon, although we can imagine that a different pantheon would interpret these things differently. But that they are, we can't help but be motivated and act and see the world through them. We're always, either with Jupiter or we're with Venus or something. There's always some kind of a,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He even takes this so that as a former evangelical Christian, grew up in the Baptist church, that sounds a lot like demonic possession. And even like sort of, I believe it's in one of these essays that he addresses that, or was that in the other book as well?
He does. He compares Jung to Karl Jaspers.
Right, who talks about demon instead of daemon, right?
Yeah, but really daemon is lumped into it, and he is advocating for monotheism and spirit, and he's very Jaspers is very 19th century, so all this demonology and all this, it's a psychopathology, it's a primitivism, we don't want to retreat into that, we want to get beyond that. So his whole epistemology is, there's one world, and there's sort of a right way to see it and a wrong way to see it.
Right. And all these sort of many different lenses that Hillman is reifying, saying these are great,
Yeah.
and necessary,
Or inevitable.
Inevitable. Jaspers would say, no, that's the bad stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's to be left behind.
Right.
I thought that was actually very helpful, bringing Jaspers into it. I was kind of surprised when he did it.
What did you find useful about it?
Well, one of the things that Hillman's so big on, and I think it's a good thing about Hillman, is he's very much about making a distinction between soul and spirit. And these days we tend to conflate the two. A lot of the popular pop jargon anyway.
Right.
And he is saying that what is happening is we have gotten so far removed from soul that there's no place for spirit really to land. So it's just a mental distraction. And there's a sort of a Enlightenment, Cartesian, rationalist epistemology behind that.
Right. Right.
And he would, I think if he was alive today, he didn't die too far long ago, but I think he would argue that these things are, that epistemology is actually dying as we speak. And
the spirit-based epistemology?
Yeah. Because we're getting so much more sophisticated about, especially anthropology, about worldviews.
Sure.
So I'm referring to a weird studies episode I just listened to, but maybe it was even Room Soup, one or the other. But they were saying that anthropology started as this real Victorian, imperial, Eurocentric thing,
right?
That looked at all these tribes as being, primitive, and as though, the pinnacle of evolution was, Victorian England or something.
Right, right.
But then somewhere around 1950, a few anthropologists, and it's very interesting, they say that they didn't make a lot of noise about this. If they had, they probably would have encountered a lot of resistance. But they started doing field work, and they started coming back and saying, this is a viable worldview. This is a viable epistemology.
Right.
And they started realizing that the data that they were collecting was being informed by their own biases.
Right.
And I think that, once that started happening, people started, you could argue quantum physics and all these other things, but this sense of there being this black and white scientism actually in a way starts undercutting itself.
Mm-hmm. Because the data they're finding is that, it's not just primitive people who evolved into us, it's a multiplicity of ways of experiencing and viewing the world that are equally valid, right? Yeah.
And physics is telling us the outcome of the experiment is very much dependent on the observer. Right. Right. And so that would fit with what, Hillman's saying, which is, there's one world out there, but there's, what he calls in here, a pandemonium of images. Right.
Right. So it's very much, the difference between Jaspers and Hillman is very much a difference. And I think Hillman is like up front and center about this, the difference between sort of a monotheism and a polytheism.
Yeah, but Hillman would call it a polytheistic psychology.
Psychology, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so he's talking about Jaspers on page 70, and he says, this is his critique of what he calls demonology, which is this other way of seeing the world, which younger Hillman, he says it misses transcendence. Mm-hmm. Because the gods have become the world. 2, the individual man has no irreplaceable value because now we're legion, right?
Right.
Meaning we're inhabited by Eros,
Sure.
Jesus, and everybody
But
else.
it's hard to point to the thing that's essentially me if it's just all kinds of
Exactly. My ego is just one part of this thing.
Right.
No relation to the one is gain. Fragmentation. Man splits into his potentialities. Everything can be justified. Right. The demon made me do it.
Right.
Demonology is submerged in nature. Man loses his distinction from nature.
Right.
Modern demonology is purely an aesthetic attitude. Man no longer need commit himself because for every situation he has a stock of aesthetic images. Their illusory grandeur. And last, demonology sets up an intermediary form of being that is neither empirical nor transcendent actuality. Everything that is not either world or God is deception and illusion. That's what Jaspers would say.
Right.
And I think Hillman's reply to that would be exactly.
Right. Yeah, that's what we're about. Yeah.
Yeah, Hillman would say we live in that place between matter and God, and he would say that whole realm is soul realm.
Right. And try to reclaim that and bring that back into psychology. Bring that back into make room for it within the sort of modernist or whatever postmodernist like worldview.
Yeah.
And he positions himself, at least in the other book, he positions himself as against rationalism on the one hand and Christianity on the other.
Yeah.
In Jaspers, we see exactly why the Christianity, because what they demonize is exactly more or less what he's trying to uphold. Yeah. And then with rationalism, he is essentially equivalent, I think, to literalism for him.
Yeah, I would say so. At least the external world is just matter.
And the perspective of the rational worldview is the only legitimate one. And it takes itself, rather than as like a way of viewing things that could be productive, it takes itself as like the only truth.
And the final arbiter.
Right.
Now, what's interesting about Christianity is in this book, it's basically a footnote. He describes Jung as somebody who managed to maintain both the soul and the Christian attitude. So he doesn't rule that out. And in fact, he points in his other writings to the Renaissance and different periods of Christianity where a kind of pagan worldview coexisted or even interpenetrated a Christian.
Right.
But he says the tendency is always that Christianity will crush that. Soul will show up in the Renaissance and we'll inherit all that pagan wisdom and we'll look at Jewish Kabbalah and we'll do all this wild stuff.
Yeah.
But then something like the Reformation will come along and it'll stamp it back down.
Smash it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But he would argue that soul's always gonna. He would say that you can't destroy it, just like Harper did. You can try to destroy the images, but there's no escaping the images.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, and especially if. Well, let me read this quote about what imagination is. So he defines imagination in the way that's perplexing but really powerful. On 78, this is in the Jung section. He says that his definition of imagination is the permeating, unconscious aspects of all things. Meaning that, like, there's no way to get out of imagination. There's no escape from it. It is in all objects. It is everywhere, all around us. It's already in our perception. It's in our memories and in our daydreams, but even in just how we talk to other people and live our lives. Everywhere there's an imaginal aspect of things going on, and arguably, like, it's the fundamental thing. Yeah, in fact, he says the images, which are the very stuff of our souls, this is on 85. Images, which are the very stuff of our souls, are the only givens directly presented, meaning we don't have access to any other world than the images that our psyche gives us.
Right.
Everything else, the world, other persons, our bodies, are mediated to consciousness by this poetic ancestral factor of the image. Meaning, if you see the television or the refrigerator or whatever, you're only seeing the image of that is, already comes burdened with all this perspectival stuff from the archetypes or whatever else.
Yeah, maybe not burdened, but laden.
Yeah, right. Painted over with it, infused. So whatever we say about the world, other persons, or bodies is affected by these archetypal fantasy images. And then blah, blah, blah. All existence is structured by imagination. So you can try to have an iconoclastic sort of perspective and say, there shall be no more images in the church. These are pagan representations or something. But you can't ever get away from images because you're living in them. You inhabit them. You yourself are an image.
Right. So the moving towards literalism is just a kind of, it's a vain attempt at something.
Right.
It's an impoverished soul, but it's still, you'll never really get there.
Right. So this has go ahead.
It's just so wild when you think about it, because the example, a lot of things came to me through this, but the example of how you remember something versus I can remember watching Stand By Me, the movie, right?
Yeah.
25 years ago.
Yeah.
And being kind of really taken with it, and the era and childhood and the spookiness and all that. And then for 25 years, and the song now is different to me.
Oh, wow.
And then 25 years later, I watched the movie again. And it wasn't really a sense of disappointment or anything. It was just like you suddenly see how much imaginal fantasy I had added to the movie. But the actual film itself now was laden with Piers's memory and experience. And
that's wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it is a movie about memory too, which is an interesting feature of that.
Childhood. Yes, that's a big Stephen King thing. Experience through the eyes of a child.
Right. What an interesting movie to have that experience with, which is right. You're like the Richard Dreyfuss going back and remembering. I want to talk about his take on memory because it's one of, to my mind, the most disturbing parts of this book. And unfortunate. I'm not sure I would recommend this book to anybody for a couple of reasons, but I want to bracket that for a second and talk about he has some practical implications for how, why this matters, or how you would do imaginal work, especially in the third essay he's got. Well, in the second essay, he's got some guidelines for what active imagination should look like, what it is and what it isn't. And then in the third essay about Adler, he's got some examples of clients active imagination work that are all very helpful, I think, in sort of fleshing out. He's very much like a theory guy. He's out in the clouds, everything's imagination and the archetypes are always ruling us. But what does that look like in practice, and what are the benefits of it, right?
Yeah.
So a couple of things he says about how to do active imagination on page 82 and 83. He makes this distinction between, I'm going to say this wrong because it's Latin, but latria and dulia.
Yeah.
Which is latria is sort of worship, the way you might worship God, the highest being. And dulia is, he says, an attitude of service. And then he makes this distinction about what is the proper relationship to images. If you take an image and then worship it, like latria, if you say, this is the thing, this is the scientific perspective, or whatever it might be that you hold up, then you've committed idolatry, he said. That's sort of the appropriate icon to class. We don't want to take these things literally. But if you consider yourself as someone who lives in the service of the images that inhabit you, then that's more appropriate. So when we're doing active imagination, when we're dreaming and remembering dreams, when we're have an inspiration and create a piece of art, when we're talking to aspects of our psyche that are disturbing to us or problematic, then there's just an attitude of service toward them
Mhm.
rather than expecting them to be of service to us.
Right. Which you would say is a power play.
Right. It's so he says that like and a lot of the examples in the Adler essay are about people who encounter some imaginal character who is trying to tell them something, and then the client, instead of listening and dialoguing with and trying to understand and being in service to this character or this figure, tries to kind of translate them into a concept,
Right.
tries to like pick them apart for what they, how am I going to take you and turn you into a cure for my depression?
Yeah.
How am I going to sort of pull you apart and figure out what you mean so that the ego can be stronger,
Yes.
more capable of handling itself in the midst of whatever crisis? Or, you know, what is this sort of mystical sign about how can I take you as an omen for what I should do in my future?
Mm-hmm.
And all of these moves are ego-centered moves that are meant to sort of strengthen and comfort the ego and cure it of its symptoms.
And enhance its standing in the world.
Right. Right. So instead of that, the motion is for the ego to listen. If an imaginal figure shows up and is trying to tell you something, ask it what it's trying to tell you. See what it says. Let it speak to you about what it wants to speak to you about, and don't try to. I mean, I think this is tricky because I've definitely like made all the mistakes in the little bit of active information I've done or dream interpretation I've done. It's always ego-centered. It's always trying to interpret and draw meaning from. And,
Right.
So this was it was an interesting challenge. It's like, so then you just sort of let it do its thing, and you live with the image rather than live off the image.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And so therapy for him is, and Jung, is to serve the gods.
Right. Right. Which puts you in kind of a weird space because you may just like you're depressed. Your therapist is telling you, well, let's do some dream work. You come up with these dreams and hoping that in them is somehow an answer to your depression. And the therapist is like, well, why don't you just live with that image for a while? I can see there be frustration with that because we want answers. We want results.
There's urgency.
Yeah.
Somewhere in his writings, he suggests, and this is really a departure from Jung, he suggests that the image, the dream is itself the therapy. It doesn't, any kind of interpretation you subject it to will necessarily narrow it.
Right.
It's always a reduction.
Right.
And he suggests that sometimes when dreams are really healing, it's because they provide us with an emotion. They serve up a certain emotional flavor that meets whatever's going on in the psyche, or it's a feeling is being brought into consciousness. And that seems really true to me, although I think it's fairly exceptional. I mean, I've certainly had dreams. I've had dreams that have given me. I've experienced emotions in dreams I've never experienced in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And some of them leave me changed. They do change. You see, the other thing about this is like everything has got to slow way down, because you have to maybe be with these images for a long time,
right?
And that eventually, if you work with them long enough, they'll become pregnant with. They'll start speaking and giving you even more than they did initially, and now you're in kind of a relationship,
right?
There are people in this kind of realm that would say mythology is really about communication. And so what we do is we look at, mythology, and this is the common one with the Greeks, like you read it and you're like, how the fuck did people believe this shit? And these gods, they behave like bad children, and you're going to worship that?
Right.
But the mythology is actually a form of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So the dream, in that sense, is a form of communication, but it's not a simple. It's like life. It's not. It's got multivalent meaning.
Right. It's difficult, I think. It's difficult. So there's a couple things that we've gone over that are really challenging from him, like on a gut level. One is like, don't take basically anything literally.
Right.
Which puts you in this position where, like, well, then what the fuck is true? Like, how do I feel like you're dog paddling in the, green slime or something. There's no fixity to it. It's very, in a sense, it's postmodern like that, maybe, but there's like no like level space to say, okay, here's the ground of reality.
Right.
So you can't.
But he says there is one world. He says there's one world, and Jung says there's one collective unconscious.
You'll never see it because you're gonna be swimming in the soup.
It. So he does this in there. He says Jung could not step out of his Kantian perspective, which said the imaginal is phenomenal. Mm-hmm. We all live in it. We all go through it all the time. And the way the world really is in the Kantian sense noumenal and never to be known.
Right.
Whereas Hillman says, I don't even need to do that. There is no noumenal. Mm-hmm. The world is the pandemonium of images.
Right. So there's no escaping the right. Not only is there no escaping the imagination for us, there literally is nothing else.
Right.
Which, I mean, that's another thing, I guess, as a weird critique, is like he says, don't take anything literally, but he has a very strong perspective. Yeah. What reality is like.
Right.
So there's, I mean, to be generous, we could say he's offering us a very challenging perspective that could be useful, but he doesn't couch it that way. He doesn't say that's what he's doing. He's just like hitting us with this weird idea. Yeah, he seems to be taken literally.
Yeah, and he's just, he's just not patient with the word transcendent at all.
Right.
And God, in that sense, is, he's not spirit, he's not God, he's a champion of soul. He seems to believe it's the only, well, I think he does believe it's the only lens through which to understand culture,
right.
Humanity.
So, yeah, it's, on the one hand, there's no literal thing. On the other hand, we're not supposed to draw any meaning from the images. So, like,
well, he says in the end, he says we can draw meaning from the images in this sort of never-ending way.
Yeah, right? Images upon images upon images, and that's the only purpose.
Yes.
So it seems to, so all of his work in a way is challenging to the ego, because it's like, you're not going to have any ideas to hang your hat on.
Yep.
Not going to have any purpose because the whole thing is just images washing over each other forever. And you're not going to have any meaning because to draw specific fixed meaning is just a way of bolstering the ego. You just have to live in this unfolding reality of images and just like go with it, man.
Yeah.
Which is tough if you're trying to like live some kind of stable life where you're an ego functioning in the consensual reality. Then it's like pulling at you in all these different ways. And it's like, I can feel myself resisting him, not only for, well, we haven't talked about the things I don't like about him, but like, but I'm also resistant because my ego is resistant to this idea of living this way. Right.
Yeah. And why is your ego resistant to it?
Oh, I want to know things for sure. And I want to listen to my dreams so I can get messages that will make my life better for sure. And I want to, when I flip the tarot card, I don't want it to be this like weird interpretive soup that's just going to go on forever. I want it to tell me how I should live next. And when I pray. I want it to connect to the God, not to a God that I don't even know if I can trust. Like, I want some solidity and right.
Yeah.
I think that's where that comes from. I'm not saying that that the resistance is correct. I'm just saying that I feel it when I'm reading him.
Yeah.
Right? Is that, whoa, what? How am I going to do that? How does that work?
It's interesting because I don't know that I've made some, decisive shift in the direction of Jung and Hillman and such, but I've been in analysis for a while, and I've lived with these ideas for a while, and I think I had that same. It was almost a nauseating feeling at first, but now it's like it just doesn't. The payoff is that life feels less impoverished.
Mm-hmm.
Corey and I will do these little games at work. Like we'll start talking about an episode of Mad Men from the perspective of Jung.
Sure.
And we suddenly realize that. Well, I don't suddenly realize, but we realize that these glasses, these lenses, really enrich your digestion, and that's a metaphor that he uses.
Right.
The images must be digested; they must be worked over. I guess maybe that's happening all the time, Hillman would say, but to be aware of that is so.
He's in the other book, at least in Revisiting Psychology, he's very much about you have to digest what is it? An event?
Yeah.
Becomes an experience?
Yes.
Something like that?
Something like that. He calls it soul making.
It has to go through this imaginal process. It has to be somewhat intentional. You have to engage in it, or it won't. You'll just be going through life with no experiences. You're just kind of buzzing through.
Yeah, that's right. So there was this. Let's see. What was it must have been Room Soup. So it's about anthropology. This recent episode he did with an anthropologist, and he's talking about that thing of suddenly saying these are viable worldviews, and he cites this anthropologist who was talking to an elder of the Chippewa people, and he was noticing in the Chippewa language you give subjectivity to non-human things routinely, and even to things that we don't think are sentient. And so he said, the language will speak of a stone as though it's a sentient being. And so the anthropologist asked the elder, are all stones sentient beings? And the elder goes, are you an idiot? Like that. He goes, no, only some stones are sentient beings.
Yeah.
And the anthropologist, of course, is all weirded out. And what the elder goes on to explain is a stone becomes a sentient being. It has a animating spirit, if you will, if a human being does ritual with it. So the ritualization of ritualized human behavior can bring spirit into these different things.
Right.
And what the anthropologist would go on to find out, he says that perspective is actually in many, many cultures. So the human has this strange ability to bring spirit into something, to I don't know, it's already ensouled, but to give it a little something extra.
Right.
So that just had me thinking, and there's this thing that I've told the story 3 times now in 3 days, but I've never told this story once in my life prior to this, but I thought about it my whole life. And when I was about 4 years old, I was playing with this little plastic clasp or something that was part of packaging for some product. And I can recall some sort of realization that it was garbage. This little plastic thing was destined for the garbage. Nobody paid attention to it, and nobody cared about it. And it filled me with this just terrible sadness. And so I gave it a name. And then I ran down to my mother and I said, "This is the name of this thing."
Yeah. Don't
And
drop
well, and she was like, could not be less interested,
it.
which disappointed me. And then I ran back to my room and I started interacting with it some more. And a story started coming and qualities and adventures. And I would run back to my mother and tell her more things about it. And she would be just disinterested. And I would run back and go back. And so this thing was becoming, right?
Yeah.
And my memory of it is so intense because the period of time at the beginning when I felt sorry for it was really sad. And the end of my memory is really kind of bummed because my mother couldn't appreciate it. But that period in between was magic.
Yeah.
It was real magic. And it was I could really understand what that Indian was saying, that there was something that I can do in relationship to the things of my world that will make them more than what they are, but is not unreal. It's actually real.
Right.
And I think that that's all kind of what that whole sort of general territory is where Hillman's at.
Right.
Yeah. He's saying that you're doing that and you can do that in a way that's aware or can grow in awareness,
right,
where you'll do that unconsciously and you'll try to literalize it and real, yeah.
I don't know how to tell the story. All right, I'm going to tell you the story too because I have a story like that too, but it's like from last year, which is I've got a dehumidifier in my basement that is like on the fritz. It's like ready to go out, and it's erratic. Like it'll like stop working, and you have to turn like it'll like beep 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 beep, but you can't turn it off with the button. You have to unplug it and plug it in again, and sometimes it just keeps going even though it's full. Sometimes it's just all kinds of erratic behaviors. So I started talking to it. I started being like, "I'm gonna have to throw you away. We're gonna have to get a new one. I don't want to do that, buddy." And then I started like doing sort of like what you were doing with that trash, like. And it's weird that it's both trash, but then I'd be like, "All right, what do you want me to do? How can I get you to work?" And I would listen, and like whatever was the first thought that came to mind, I'd be like, "Okay, cool, we'll try that." And then okay, he wants me to turn it on, and then press the up button, and then leave it alone, and then turn it off, and then come back in 20 minutes. So I would just like act as if this thing was talking to me and telling me how it needed to be sort of gently handled, right? Where at the beginning of last summer, I was convinced I was going to have to throw it away. It like worked perfectly. It like worked amazingly all summer long, right?
Did you tell anyone about this?
No, this is the first time I've told this story. So, and like you could say like, all right, well, that's not any there. But there was something there, at least in the sense of like, I'm attending to this object in a way that I wouldn't have ever cared to otherwise. The simplest thing is to toss it and get something new. But because I'm like paying attention to it, and caring about it, then I'll spend more time to like, try different things and see what makes it work, right?
Well, and look what you did. I mean, that's just what Hillman says. It's personification.
Right.
And, in Room Soup, Gordon talked about, kids just do this. Naughty chair. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm willing to believe that those two stories we just told, especially yours, because it's adulthood, I bet you everybody has a story like that. Sure.
You just sort of personify something.
Yeah, I certainly know that I watch, maybe Jessica get impatient with something, and I'm like, I just want to, let me do it.
Right.
And I slow everything down. I mean, I really believe that.
Yeah.
It's not even I'm imagining. I believe that when I approach the electronic thing, I am actually slowing everything down.
Right.
And I'm giving it some relief and some patience and some attention.
Yeah.
And I would say maybe it's just my fantasy that more often than not I make it work.
Right. I think that there's probably a lot of people who would think this is crazy, but then when they think about how they talk to their cars, they would go, "Oh yeah, I have a name for my car," and I'm always like, "Come on, baby."
Yeah,
Especially,
yeah, or a car they once had to go, "Damn, that was a good car."
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's a way. Like a way of, like he says, it's like a way of being in relationship to things that's like different. It's not rational, obviously, but it is weirdly productive and allows you to see things and relate to things differently.
Yeah, it reminds me of. I'm trying to look it up, but I can't find the quote.
Yeah.
Okay, Dick talking about God, finding God in a garbage heap.
Mm. Right. Same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Didn't he get shot by a laser from space that was like, whoa?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's cool.
He had the whole experience.
Right. Oh, speaking of that, the thing that finally did it for me with this book, in a good way, was at the very end. It's like very last example of somebody doing active imagination. It was like, I always feel like I need examples from this guy, and he almost never gives them. But at the end of this book, he's like, well, here's this one active imagination thing. And the guy's, he's writing about, there's like a voice that wants to be dominant. There's like something in him. It's like the inner voice. What does he call it? Let me see in my notes. I know I wrote it down. I was like, this was spooky for me. Oh, the chest voice. He has a voice in his chest. And it says, it wants to be the large to your small. As long as I am in your interior, in your psychology, and in your projections, I never come to full stature. And like the evangelical hairs on the back of my neck are like, don't let the devil out, right? This is spooky. But he goes with it. And like, I don't know if he's like, says yes to it, or is just like, all right, I'm listening to that, I'm living with you. And then he has this experience of the chest voice coming out and taking over. And he says this about it, or it says this about it. He takes a swim. He goes for a swim. And on coming out of the water, he experienced his body wrapped in space that was full of presence and air that had density. He heard her say distinctly, so loud as if it was a hallucination, "Now I am out. Now you are in." Which again is like, it didn't happen, but it is like, and then it turns out to be really productive for him. Like so he has this weird soul inside him that wants to get out, and then he's inside the world of soul.
Yeah.
And then he goes, he quits does he quit his job? He gives up on group therapy, joins up with nonprofit work. There's teachers at like a night school or something. He's volunteering to help them. He takes on another volunteer job. He like sort of shifts from his role, like his previous relationship with the world was one of sort of taking for himself or about his own ego, and it becomes about service and giving and giving and giving.
That's in
it's on page 137, 138, 141. It's like quite a bit. And then his analysis of it is like, when he was with Psyche, it was love that included him as one of its images and expanded out of its own accord into fellow feeling.
Yeah, fellow feeling. That was the thing I really liked about Adler.
Yeah.
As he said that Adlerian, a major component of Adlerian theory is Gemeinschaft, communal feeling or social interest.
Mm-hmm.
We refuse to recognize and examine an isolated human being because there is no escaping the ironic logic of communal life.
Right. We're always in relation to others all the time.
Right. And I was surprised that was in Adler. I mean, because I just got this sort of basic Adlerian thing of, will to power. And the fact that it's so communal it really, and then the sort of championing of inferiority or broken.
Yeah, that was a key term. There was feeling broken, feeling inferior, and that was the way toward being in the fellow feeling, right? In ways that were very like, it was like, oh, this is like an AA meeting.
Yeah, a really good AA meeting. That's right. That we actually allow the failures to eclipse, to deflate the ego. I mean, it's a rift on ego deflation at depth, really.
Yeah.
And we can come together when we are not jostling for power.
He says this on 122. We're human less by virtue of our ideal goals than by the voice of our inferiority. The best entry into imperfection is humor, self-irony, dissolving in laughter, the acceptable humiliation that requires no after compensation upwards. The sense of imperfection may be one way into communal feeling. Another surer one is the all too human bond of a sense of humor, which sounds like, he went to a good meeting and was like, hey, all these people are laughing about how fucked up they are.
Yeah.
And it's really drawing them together. Right.
Yep. Yeah. And you walk out of there feeling lighter.
Right. And so this other guy in his active imagination with the weird, spooky spirits, multiple perspectives, maybe they're demons, maybe there's something else. He walks out of that with like a pretty powerful, transformative spiritual experience. Equivalent to what you may, the best thing that you could get out of the steps. Mm-hmm. By letting soul out, he was able to transform from selfish centeredness to a life of service.
Yeah, and that is that's kind of what my big takeaway from the book is that there's something about, addiction or untreated alcoholism, whatever, bringing you to, the powerlessness comes with a humility, and then you can meet others in that place. It seems like so valuable. It's impossible if you don't meet others in that place, because otherwise you'll just hate yourself, right?
Yeah.
And then, but the challenge is that the ego asserts itself in recovery, sometimes in sobriety.
Right.
It's not, I think we just had it all wrong. When I'm shooting dope all the time, I'm not in my ego. I'm out of control.
Right.
Yeah, there's a demon here, right?
Right.
Then I get a little bit of time, and then all this like thinking I can dominate this thing, or I have dominated, whatever.
Yeah.
And then I start kind of getting in competition with other people. Really striking.
Yeah.
And so how do you stay, does this imply that if you stay with soul in some sort of Jungian, Hillmanian sense, you will keep that in check? You will actually build your capacity to build a network of intimate relationships will grow out of that.
Yeah. I think in a way you're almost ahead of Hillman here. At least in these essays, he ends with that guy having his experience and becoming a life of service. You're almost asking the question of like, let's come back to this guy in 5 years when he's all full of himself for being the most helpful guy in town.
Right.
Now what? Like, how does he move forward from that? Right.
Right. How does he stay with his inferiority, his creatureliness? And that becomes some sort of challenge of spirituality. Because another thing that comes out of this book is the strong sense that self-improvement is so oppressive.
Right.
So violent.
Not the goal.
Not the goal, but just the trying to be better all the time.
Yeah.
Failing and the inevitable comparisons and the sense of being a fraud. And it's like this weird thing comes, it's like the shadow of the steps.
Yeah.
Comes in. Yeah.
Well, I think that you're naming my struggle, probably both of our struggle of like when, and I think frankly, like every old timer's struggle is like, I had this experience a long time ago, trying to be faithful to it. I caught fire for a long time, ran into reality in whatever different ways. Some people catch a secondary addiction. Some people just like burn out or see things differently.
And most of us hold on dearly to looking good in the eyes of the others.
And so, yeah, we become kind of dried out in the sense of like, I have to keep telling my story in a way that doesn't feel authentic to me because that's what's useful to others. And that's what like sells, honestly. Is like, that's what's going to convince people to get better, is them seeing me as something that I don't feel like I am inside. And then there's this like inauthenticity of, and you've lost it completely, right?
Yeah.
You're like what they call whitewashed tombs is in Matthew, right? You're like,
yeah,
nothing left inside.
Whitewashed tombs. Jesus.
So how do you get back or go forward? I don't know if it's back. I don't know what the metaphor is, but how do you bring life back into that?
Well, that's the thing. It's something about life, and so Jung will talk about the images. There has to be some way that you are still available to numinous images, meaning, or the door to numinosity is still open. And such is the danger of religion or something, in that you're always returning to the same images again and again and again and again, and they're
right
out. And dreams, they bring us these strange, unconventional, deeply personal images.
Right. So maybe there's a way to life in that. I guess like the summary for the polytheism would be like, everything is sacred. Everything's imaginal. Everything is sacred. Treat it with service. And if you can do that, I guess whatever rises up in your life and in your psyche is all going to be the next right thing.
Yeah, I mean, that almost sounds hard to believe, given some of the things that rise up in my psyche.
That's right.
Like, we don't want to do that.
Right. Well, so yeah, that's what another, like, I guess this is the other book again, but he has this whole thing about against a singular view of morality, against the notions of guilt and forgiveness in ways that are very much anti-step, or like I think Hillman would go to an AA meeting and be like, awesome. And then he'd read the steps and go, fuck no.
Yeah. That's profound. I think that's right. I think he would walk through the corridors of a detox and be about as he would be in service. He would be yeah. And then when he got wind of the whole self-improvement thing, he would be horrified.
Spiritual experience? No, he doesn't want that, because too spiritual, not sold, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a valid criticism.
Sure. Yeah, and the idea that you're confessing things and making amends for them, and he would see that as like all wrapped up in, rightly so, in sort of Christian views of redemption.
Yeah,
and recovery and redemption are very close brethren.
But then there's also the Christian things of humility and I'm always a sinner.
Yeah, right.
I have a feeling when we do the next big book thing, we'll probably end up in that area.
I can't let this book go. I don't know if we're close to time or not.
We should wind up.
I can't let us go without mentioning the couple things that really, I should do this at the beginning, honestly, because I hate to end on a bummer, but like there's pieces about this book that were like, I don't know if it's like a content warning, but this book is really problematic and dated in certain ways. And one of the ways is that he's full on board with Freud's denial of the reality of childhood sexual abuse. He calls it like the founding truth of psychology, and the whole cult of psychology, he says, is built around that. And he says that, sexual trauma happened to people, but only in their imaginations. And then it's actually this, mythic reenactment, and that the fact that of that is the basis of thinking that psyche has some independent reality, because people are reporting events as real that he says are not.
Right.
Super problematic in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
And possibly very triggery in some kind of ways. If you experience that and you're going to read this, it could be re-traumatizing, because here's somebody saying it didn't happen to you. I say, fuck that. I say there's much better bases for the independent reality of the psyche, including spiritual experiences are a good reason to think that there's an independent reality of the psyche, and any dream that you might have. And the kind of active imagination that he was talking about later is much better grounds for believing in something like that.
Oh, I wonder what was going on when he wrote this. I mean, was the satanic panic, I put that in quotation marks.
Yeah, right.
Was that going on where suddenly everyone was, and that's been so, false memory syndrome has been so demolished.
Yeah.
But it certainly had its time.
Right.
But I don't want to make apologies. I just wonder what was going on.
Yeah, no, yeah. So I guess the historical work that sort of picked apart, well, why did Freud make this conclusion that sexual trauma isn't real? And it's because he didn't want to make himself an outcast in the society he was in. And the fathers that were doing the abusing are all his patrons and peers and stuff. He didn't want to rock the boat. All that work does come about in the 70s, kind of when he's writing this. I don't know how familiar he would have been with it or not. I don't think he was too receptive to it, from what I can tell.
No, he used the other perspective to validate his own.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something to be aware of. I don't think that he's still, if you're going to try to make a strong argument for what imagination is, or you want to really dive into well, how does imagination work, or what would it look like if we really sort of interpreted the world through an imaginal lens, you can't, this is where to go, I think. He mentions a few other scholars like Mary Watkins.
Yeah, she's very good.
She's great. So if you want to avoid the abuse denial, but still get into the imagination, maybe go with her. Or I guess Jung. I don't think Jung was on board with that.
I don't think so. No.
In the same way that Hillman was, which is weird.
Yeah, and Hillman's later, so you would think sensitivity to trauma would have been greater with Hillman.
Right. Yeah. So again, ending on a bummer, but I felt like it should be said.
The thing. So just for the record, a lot of people in the Jungian world don't like him much.
Yeah. Right.
He's not the most popular guy. He was a bit of a womanizer, and he left a trail of broken hearts. And so the other thing about him, he liked being the bad boy of depth psychology. So I think, he liked to poke at things.
Right.
I don't know if that's the case of this here or not. But
maybe that would have been edgy to take that stance,
take that stance. Raising eyebrows.
Right.
All right. Well, I think we got a good book for the next one. I will not, whatever that's called. No spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Just a good book.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Thanks for the chat.
All right, buddy.
Bye.
Peace.